Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Dave. I'm a parent of a daughter in college, and we live in Chicago, Illinois.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University.
This week in the news, high school extracurriculars are nice. College extracurriculars are huge. A great story by Jay Matthews of the Washington Post. Our questions from a listener will be a series of questions that Mark and Lisa will address. Our interview is we start a brand new interview with Jon Boeckenstedt, the VP of Enrollment at Oregon State. Jon will be talking about which admission practices are unethical.
Dave is back, and he's fresh, man. I think putting you on the monthly regiment was what we needed. That pep in that step is back. It's the old Dave.
That's right. I get to sleep.
Well, guess what you're not going to get to do? I'm pulling up the old quiz on you again today. Like old times. It's not going to be admissions vernacular, though. I'm mixing it up a little bit. I'm actually going to quiz you on the big numbers, so we'll get to that.
Okay.
So our admissions vernacular is the word demonstrated intentionality. So we've got demonstrated interest. Is somebody likely to enroll? Demonstrated understanding. Do they get who we are? This is a new term that I'm starting to hear people use for the first time, and it makes sense. And it has to do with, can I see how a student's application aligns itself with our programming and what we have to offer, and is there consistency, or is somebody all over the place? So demonstrated intentionality. Our admissions tip concerns repurposing essays. So this is the time of year where that's a huge part of what I'm doing, meeting with students, reading essays, giving feedback, whether it's personal statements, whether it's personal interest questions, they're looking at the UCs, or whether or not it's college-specific essays. And one of the topics that always comes up is, can I repurpose my essay? And the answer is, you can sometimes, but tread lightly. Of course, everybody likes to repurpose essays. This student this week that's literally using the same essay for 4 schools, but it's very, very, very tricky. And I'll tell you why. So let's say you get a question from one school, and it says, tell me about an activity outside of high school you really enjoy. That's your topic, okay? That's a perfect kind of essay that could be repurposed. But then you go to another school and it says, tell me about an activity outside of high school you really enjoy that you plan to continue at our college. Now that's a different question, because now you need to talk about that activity, but there needs to be some customization to the specific school you're applying to. And that's one place a lot of people fall short. They don't have that customization, and then the essay falls flat. I'll give you another example. Here's an essay. Tell me about something you haven't shared anywhere else in your application. 300 words. Okay. Another school. Oh, I'm so happy. I'm so excited. I got the same question. Tell me about something you haven't written about in your application. 200 words. Well, guess what? You got to put a lot of work in to take your 300-word essay and get it down to 200 words and still do a quality essay. And a lot of times I see people sort of roughshotting through that. Oh, I basically got the same question. I'll cut corners and produce work that's not that quality. Does that make sense, Dave?
It makes very much sense. It is, and you're absolutely correct. The hardest thing about those essays is not the long length, it's the short length, because every word and sentence structure counts if you're trying to squeeze something into 200 words. It's just not a whole lot of space. So if you custom design things for 300 words, you have to really completely restructure it to make 200, because essentially you're cutting out 1/3 of the content, which is very difficult.
And to speak to your point, literally I was in a session last night with a student who's doing a really good job on their call specific questions, but they said to me, I'm just completely drawing a blank on this one.
Yeah.
I'm overwhelmed. I'm drawing a blank. What was the issue? Virginia Tech's got that same question back where they asked 4/5 questions in one question, and the word count is like 150 words. It might be 100.
Yeah.
It's really low. And it's tough to do. You can't have that 15-word intro that you're used to doing in your English writing. You had to be efficient.
Yeah.
You're right, Dave. Those are the hardest ones. All right. So, as I told you, I'm moving my quiz
All right.
to the big number. This is your competitive juice. So, this is the question. Which university gets the most dollars for research and development? I'll tell you how much it is because it's our big number. It's $2.5 billion a year.
For R&D.
You want some hits?
Okay, give me some hints.
Okay, they have topped the list of the National Science Foundation ranking for highest research and development funding for 10 years in a row.
Jesus, I'm thinking it's got to be like the MITs, the CITs, or something
Nope.
like that. No.
Nope.
Okay, no.
Two. Strike one, strike two.
Okay.
I'm going to give you 5 on this one.
Okay.
Here's something else that's bizarre.
Oh, okay.
They get $1 billion more than the second place. So second place is $1.5 billion, and they're getting $2.5 billion. Not MIT. Those are good guesses, by the way.
Okay, so I'm thinking it's got to be a huge state school. I'm thinking about maybe Cal Berkeley.
That's another great guess. Yeah. I mean, all these guesses you're proffering are ones I probably would have guessed.
Okay,
but you're 0 for 3. Two more.
I'm not saying Harvard because that's going to be too obvious. Because of course they have the biggest endowment. But you're be much more specific. You're talking about.
Okay, I'm going to give you a big hint.
Yeah.
A big hint.
Yeah.
Because you're running out of guesses. It's a school. I'll just say it is a school Lauren seriously looked at.
Well, she didn't look at Princeton, so I'm not going to say Princeton.
You always try to get Princeton anytime you can.
Great
Princeton and Tesla.
Okay. Okay, well, I'm going down the list. Maybe Johns Hopkins.
You got it, dude.
Oh, jeez.
except you didn't get it because it's Johns Hopkins.
Johns Hopkins.
It's Johns Hopkins. So,
when they didn't accept me and because I spelt the name wrong, I should have wrote back and says I was trying to get in under the letter count. I found that the S wasn't necessary. John Hopkins.
For those of you who don't know, that was the one school that Dave didn't get in. Dave had a full ride to Duke Medical School. He had all kinds of offers, but one place that snubbed him was Johns Hopkins. So he takes it out on them and he drops the S off their name.
That's right.
Yeah, but there you go. $2.5 billion per year in research and development.
Awesome.
You didn't get the second choice either.
Okay, wait.
You're close.
Well, Hopkins has said that huge medical research, which is gobs of money.
One guess, because we can't make this our whole episode. I like seeing you squirm, though.
Oh, gee. Okay, it wasn't Hopkins. Okay.
And please, that listener out there, don't write in and say, stop giving Dave a hard time. Think about the kids like that one person
That's
did.
right.
I'm just having fun.
That's right.
Just having fun.
You're going to spark an anti-bullying campaign. I'm going to guess. Oh, shoot, UCLA.
Good, very, very good guess. The University of Michigan.
Okay, cool. Okay, no problem.
Ann Arbor, number 2. Yeah, number 2. Yep. Awesome. Good stuff. So, Dave, take it away, my friend.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
All right. Well, this is a short article, but I like it because it's short and sweet and it brings out some good points. And it is an article by Jay Matthews, and it's entitled High School Extracurriculars Are Nice, but College Extracurriculars Are Huge. And the subtitle is How My Spare Time, Pastime Got Me a Job and the Love of My Life. I don't like the subtitle. It sounds too like Viewish, quite frankly.
Sure.
But bottom line, what she says is college applicants know how important high school extracurriculars.
Not she, by the way. Jay Matthews is a guy. I've had a
Oh,
chance to
is a
meet him.
guy?
He's the lead educational writer for the Washington Post and has been so for decades.
Oh,
you
wow.
know? So yeah, so Jay's one of those names that I guess could go either way.
Well,
It's a guy.
Jay was showing his sensitive side, so that's good. He eschewed the toxic masculinity of this column. That's nice. So college applicants know how important high school extracurricular activities are in selective admissions. Hardly anyone is telling them, however, what power the activities they pursue during college can have over the rest of their lives. So what Jay basically says is that experiences outside of the class may have far more impact on your life than the grades of your textbooks or whatever your professor said in philosophy 1B. And I absolutely agree with him, because what he says is that many times what students get involved in college can be unexpected and truly transformative to the choice of their careers and the people they hang out with. And in cases of Jay, it even led to his future life partner. But he says the problem is that there's not many guides that are published during the college selection process that tells you in depth about the whole breadth and depth of extracurriculars that you can experience in any one college. He said, quote, he quoted a Connie Livingston, a former admissions director at Brown, that said, "I don't know of a resource on extracurriculars at state schools, specifically nor one for private colleges." He said, counselors can help track down opportunities, but it's really up to the efforts of the student to really bear fruit on what they think they could be involved in college. So Jay has a couple nuggets of advice. Number one, he said you could check with friends and family who know people who work in the fields that interest you and see if they have links at the colleges that you're interested in. For instance, he always knew that places like Northwestern and Missouri and Columbia had great reputations for teaching journalism. But once he started at the Washington Post, he found that some of the biggest counts came from schools he had never heard of, such as State University of New York at Buffalo. And he said, where you go to school is less important than how hard your favorite extracurricular activity inspired you to work at that school. And sometimes you have no idea where the hidden strengths are at various schools. He also said that sometimes it's hard to find the missing critical mass of young people at campus that are playing around with wild ideas. He cited Hewlett Packard and Facebook as examples of companies that grew out of young people getting together in college, coming up with a great idea and forming a company while in college that went to great things. And sometimes it's hard to figure out which colleges are going to have those critical mass of people in the field that you might be interested in. But he said that it could help if you look at websites of large state universities to find the clubs and associations that might bring together students and faculties with these different ideas. He also mentions fraternities and sororities. He said that fraternities and sororities can often lead to useful contacts and help guide you to management experience. He talked about after-class jobs and how that can really be a lead-in. And then he said that if there's things in the college that interest you, contact its student associations and ask what's going on. And he concludes by saying, quote, "The college guides don't appreciate the overwhelming power of young people living and studying together for the first time, organizing their days without having to check with their parents. In such circumstances, both creative and romantic sparks fly." And he said that as a managing editor in college, he eventually met his wife, who agreed to marry him on graduation day. So he wrapped it up with a sweet little story. So what do you think about this article, Mark?
Several things, but before I do, credit where credit is due. So this article comes to us from Mary from Connecticut. And Dave, this is the same Mary that drove an hour and a half to give you freshly baked cookies when you... Remember that in the pandemic when you were working up that way?
Absolutely. This is an amazing story, guys. I was working in Connecticut. I was basically working in lockdown, isolated. Everybody was wearing masks, and this wonderful woman called Mary drove all the way to my hotel room and dropped off some wonderful, wonderful cookies. So, Mary, thank you so much. You have a fond place both in my heart and in my stomach. So, thank you.
Dave still talks about those cookies.
It was wonderful.
Hey, with all of the drama and trauma out there, there's some good people out here in the world.
It
So that
really
was
was.
a heartwarming story.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's several things I think about this article. I liked it a lot. First of all, it starts out saying it draws a contrast between high school extracurriculars. Like, people fixate so much on high school extracurriculars, and I'm not trying to say they're not important, but what I see too much fixation on is, does it count more if I doing volunteering work, or if I play a varsity sport, or if I get a job? And there's a fixation on that in the high school process, and then almost a neglect on the college side. And the truth is, on the high school side, so many different paths will get you where you're trying to go, because colleges just want you to do what you love, and they're looking for all types of kids. So you just chase what you love. On the college side, it becomes extremely important for so many different reasons. You know, Lisa and I just teased out this conversation that we want to have about all of the things that are not talked about that should be discussed more when it comes to what leads to opportunities. There's so much talk about the rankings and the prestige of the school, but what about all these other things that get overlooked and get neglected that actually have very high correlation to life activities? And this is one of those things. So what am I saying? Well, you end up so many times getting your job by these activities that you do. You also get to figure out and discover what you're good at.
Yeah.
You get to discover what you love. And you oftentimes get introduced into very powerful networks. One thing that young people don't know, but they'll find out pretty soon as they get older, that there's a lot of truth to it's not what you know, but who you know.
Yeah.
And this is what gets you into these networks. This is what allows you to not, or at least decrease the chances that you end up picking and selecting something that you despise, that you hate. Because you may think you want to, whatever it is, be a dentist, go into finance or accounting, be a teacher, and then you get an opportunity and you realize, no, this is not going to cut it. And so, or the opposite happens. The candles of inspiration just take off.
Right.
And, I mentioned this, you guys will hear this, coming up. Well, last week, actually, I talked about it with Lisa, how I like to, when I see someone who impresses me on TV, I like to just look up where they went to college. And I challenge students to do that, because it's a great way for them to find out, oh, wow, look at all these people that went to either nondescript or non-household name colleges that are kind of doing amazing things. Maybe I don't need to go to one of these short lists of schools. But I oftentimes think, how did they get that job? And so many times it's who they knew, somebody who they met. This is why, Dave, I am a huge fan of experiential education. And I think that one way that the population needs to be evaluating colleges, much more than I see, is looking for what is the experiential aspect to your education. Yeah. And for someone who's wondering, what am I talking about? I'm talking about learning by doing. Learning by doing. And so what does that mean? Well, it's things like internships, and it's things like co-ops, but it's also other things like volunteer opportunities, things like study away and study abroad. It's opportunities to do mentoring and counseling and teaching. And there's a lot of list of creative things. Some schools have great opportunities for people that want to go into business, where you're literally starting a business. You're doing the business plan. You even have seed money. And then you're meeting with other entrepreneurs in the area, and you're getting their feedback while you literally launch a business. Like, what a great way to actually learn through doing. Yeah. So there's quite a long list. And the point is, this is really so essential. And I don't see that many families asking about it, looking into it, inquiring it, evaluating a college by that. And anytime I see a college that really emphasizes experiential learning. Again, an A+ to me, because I just know how enriching that has been in my own life. And I think it's a missed opportunity. It's a missed opportunity to not be so theoretical and have so much book knowledge that you don't know how things work in the real world. And this could actually apply to career-based things, or it could even just be hobbies and other areas of interest that bring some balance to your life. It doesn't even have to be a career pursuit. I've mostly talked in that context, but it could be, hey, I just discovered my love for mountain biking and mountain climbing, and I'm never going to pursue a career in that. But boy, that just brings me such great work-life balance that, it helps me enjoy life and keep my mental health. Thoughts, Dave?
Well, I think that's all great. I totally agree. And I've shared this story with Mark many times. The fact is that many of the things we might have done in high school may not be relevant in college. Many of the things that we were good at high school, quite frankly, you might get to college and find out that you're just not competitive, and that can often precipitate a crisis of sorts as you scramble to find out what I can I do in college. But I encourage people to keep on looking, because often what you end up doing can bring out some hidden talents and open up some opportunities that you never imagined you'd be involved in while you're in high school. Mark and I imagined ourselves as fairly good high school athletes. We were in track and basketball and soccer, and when we got to college, we both had aspirations of continuing on that route. And I remember spending like almost the whole first semester trying to make the JV basketball team, and I was on the court every single day. And I was uh, uh, going for the tryouts with the coaches. And then one day, the great Pete Carrill, who just passed away, God bless his soul, the great Princeton basketball coach, pulls me aside and says, "Williams, I love your heart. I love your dedication, but you can't play worth shit. How would you like to be manager?"
Well, I don't know what's better, yours or mine. So I actually walked on in Michigan State. I was actually our top triple jumper, but that's only because it wasn't a scholarship slotted spot. But Dave, we had 3 7-foot high jumpers. Here I am doing really well in high jump. I can jump 6 feet in high school. I think I'm hot shot. I go to Michigan State track meets. The bar starts at 6'6". That's where they start it. So check this out. We have to on Tuesdays, all the jumpers have to work out with the sprinters. And we have the number 1 mile relay team in the country. We got 4 guys that all run between 45.1 and 45.9 in the 400, which is just ridiculous. So after a couple times on Tuesday, just having them just fly by me like I'm standing still on practice, I figured out I could fake an injury and go to the trainer and talk about my hamstring to avoid humiliation. So we both got humiliated in different ways. You got it before you got on the team. I got it on the team.
That's right.
After 1 year, in fact, I remember being at a meet at the University of Michigan.
Yeah.
And I had trained for track all year round, like for years. I'd really dedicated. You remember, it was really dedicated. I almost came and lived with you guys for a year because you had a better track club than the one that I was at in 11th grade. And I remember I was at Ann Arbor for a track meet with a triple jump. And I remember this guy, and he had terrible technique. You're supposed to hop, step, jump, and all this. And I had my technique down. He like this huge hop, this baby step, and then he flew into the pit. And he like jumped 3 feet farther than me, with bad technique. And I said, you know what? I'll do track for 1 year, and I think I'm going to go on to other endeavors.
That's right.
So anyway.
And, that's such a common story. I mean, Mark, it's often we talk about how these kids who are great athletes and actually do get scholarships, but then end up not playing on the team, or losing their scholarships, or realizing that they're putting in all this effort and they'll never probably crack the starting line. And for me, it inspired me to eventually go on the school newspaper and become the managing director and do other activities that opened up some real opportunities. But I never thought that I was going to trade in my basketball shoes for a typewriter or an editor's pen. But it all worked out. I still have crushed dreams of basketball glory, but that's in another life.
Well, here's a story I've never shared on the podcast before. So my degree's in psychology at Michigan State, and I kept bouncing around. Thought I was going to be the Lisa, do the whole clinical psychology, and I realized pretty early that wasn't for me. And then I said, oh, I can do industrial psychology. I did a lot of research on it. I found out that it was quite high paying. You only needed to get a master's, and Michigan State had an outstanding master's degree in labor industrial relations. So I'm like, I'll just stay on here. I'll just get my master's. Fantastic job placement. But before I did it, I did an internship right there, right in East Lansing. And I remember I was in the internship and I walked in. And, Dave, you can kind of picture one of these like palatial law offices.
That's right.
Where they have like, it looks like every single, like, remember the old like Encyclopedia Britannica?
Yeah.
It looked like they had them all over the wall, but what it was case law going way, way back.
Yeah.
And then the guy I was reporting to said, here's your job. Get in there and go study. And then I can't remember all the details, but I had to help them prepare briefs.
Yeah.
So I had to like basically go through all the case law to help them prepare for the disputes.
Yeah.
Because it's like contract negotiations and all that, labor industrial relations. And I remember one day I was in that big office with this big cherry table and those beautiful chairs all by myself. And I remember I just put my head down on the table and the desk and I said, I can't do this for the next 30 years. I just can't.
Right.
And look, God bless those who do. It's a great field. It's lucrative. You can help a lot of people, but it just wasn't for me.
That's right.
But here's the good news. I had already started the process of looking into the master's applications and everything. So to me, that was a blessing. It saved me a lot of time. I love what I do every single day. It doesn't feel like I'm working. It's so much fun for me. I'm willing to work really, really long hours because it doesn't feel like I'm working. I'm having a blast.
That's right.
That was not going to be the case over there.
Yeah.
And so in my case, the benefit was it kept me from going awry. In somebody else's case, they could meet somebody with all kinds of connections and they could end up being, getting all kinds of opportunities and they could completely find their dream.
That's right.
But it's just getting involved in your don't miss that opportunity. Colleges abound with these opportunities, but they're not going to necessarily come knock on your dorm room door and say, get out of bed Saturday morning. Here's an opportunity. This is where you have to be proactive. One of the most important skills that a student can get and develop is to become an initiator, to become proactive. And one of the best things you can do as a parent is to help cultivate that skill.
Yeah.
And one of the worst things you can do is to smother it so much by always being the one to grab the mic and take over the opportunity, usually motivated by love because you don't want to see your kid miss an opportunity, but they're not building that independence muscle. They're not flexing and developing that independence muscle.
Right.
And that ability to be an initiator is often what separates people from people who have extraordinary careers, exemplary careers versus people that, are just kind of flatline and are kind of meh.
Right. And I want to wrap this up by saying that life is not a highway. It's not like the song "Life in a Highway." It's a series of detours. It's a winding road of experiential experiences, and it's okay to try something, figure out that's not for you, and then change direction and embark on another journey. Most successful people get to where they want to do through a series of trial and errors. Most people don't have that bright inspiration when they're 10 years old saying, I'm going to do this, and then pursue that to the end. And because circumstances in life change, even if you did, there's no guarantees that when you got to where you thought you're going to be, the whole landscape changes and you have to change course anyways. So going back to extracurriculars, that's what school extracurriculars, internships, job experiences allowed you to do. It allows you to dip your toe into a whole wide variety of experiences and see if you like it. And if you don't, hey, a no is as powerful as a yes, because, closing that door helps you to eliminate a choice until you find the eventual right path.
No, well said. And the last thing I want to say, and I realize that not everybody can can do what I'm going to say, but I'm going to say it if you are able to. The most important thing is not whether it's paid.
Yeah.
It's just getting that opportunity. And if it's unpaid and you can swing it financially and it's a great opportunity, don't make the compensation be the biggest thing.
Right.
A lot of schools are recognizing how important it is to have these opportunities, and they realize that there's students that need to make money. And so some of the wealthier schools like the Richmonds and the Williams and so many others are, they're paying kids. Washington and Jefferson is doing that outside of Pittsburgh. We'll take your unpaid internship. TCU, another one. I mean, it's a growing trend. We'll take your unpaid internship and we'll give you $3,000 or $5,000 or $4,000 because that's just how important that is. We know you need to make money, but we also know you need to find your career and find your passion and build that network.
Right.
So, awesome, Dave. Good stuff, my friend.
Awesome.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Okay, Lisa, remember how I said like a couple weeks ago I was going to table what I think would surprise you if you were admission officer for a while and do some other things? Does that sound familiar?
I do remember that. It does sound familiar.
Well, it's back.
Are you not tabling it? It's back on the table.
Well, when I get a lightning bolt of, I call it inspiration, but revelation, it's like when new ones pop in my head, I want to do it. So here's one. I think it might surprise people how, because this actually surprises admission officers, so I think it would surprise you guys. So I've had multiple conversations with admission officers who switch from one school to another school, and they are surprised at how much of a difference it makes when it comes to them getting appointments with high schools. So like when you're in travel season, right? You're traveling throughout your area, you're trying to get in. Let's say you want to do 5 schools in a day, visit. And then let's say a situation happens where a school cancels on you, which can happen all the time. Oh, person reaches out and say, I didn't realize we were on a field lesson. So can we reschedule? So now you have that time slot open. And so if you're being like really dutiful and trying to do your job, you'll probably see, well, can I schedule somebody else in their place? So what has surprised admission officers, and therefore I think it would surprise our audience, how much when they move from one institution to another, depending on the status and the prestige of the institution, it's either way easier or way harder to do last-second bookings.
Well, I guess that's the schools have their preferences too, right? So.
Well, yeah, because what kind of happens, and I do understand this because I've been on the part of organizing college fairs, when you get sort of marquee names that book the fair, you do kind of know that draws people in. So you sort of are happy when you get those marquee names because like that can increase your attendance. So I'll tell you, let me make this more tangible because this feels like very, very sort of, I don't know, nebulous, right now. So I'll give you 2 concrete examples, and we name names here. So even an institution as prestigious as Swarthmore College, I was talking with the Swarthmore rep, and she made the opposite move. So she had been at MIT and went from MIT to Swarthmore. And she was shocked at when she tried to call people at the last second, how she'd get the cold, I'm sorry.
The shade. Yeah.
Yes.
That's crazy.
Where at MIT, they always accommodated anytime she could call an hour before and say, my schedule's up, but I'm sure. So that's one story. And that was the reverse, going from more name recognition to less. And then I had one, and this is why I'm sharing the story, because this is hot off the press. This is a story from last week. I'm having a conversation with somebody I've known forever. We actually worked together for years. And so they recently went from Miami of Ohio to Ohio State. And now when they're calling at the last second, they're totally getting in. And this never happened to me before. I was just, let me take a chance. Let me call. I know it won't work. Sure, come on in. So anyway.
Oh my gosh. Well, it's like hot college privilege, I guess. I don't know.
Well, here's the hard thing about it. There's so many pros and cons of working at a really selective institution. That's one of the pros. It's easier to get in the door. You get more respect. You're at a fair and you're not by yourself. You'd rather have a lot of activity when you're at a fair because it makes like the hour and a half to 2 hours go by really fast. When you're sitting there by yourself for 90 minutes, feels like 8 hours. And I've done both. So that's a positive. This kind of stuff's a positive. But what's not a positive, and this would be more applied to MIT than Ohio State because it's a whole different level of selectivity, is you just are reading the most incredible applications that you're not admitting. And that's
right.
brutally painful. And then most of the counselors in your network, like I'm talking about the school counselors that you're networking with, they're more upset with you than they are happy because you're delivering like 95% bad news rather than good news. And so you have the arrows coming at your head. So give or take, life's not perfect, right?
No, it is
just like
not
life,
perfect.
Pros and cons to everything.
This is true.
But I would say I've had more people that have not really liked being at the highest level. It's just too painful. And I've known quite a few people that have moved down a level of selectivity and they've just found it a lot better. Like it's nice that I can give out more good news than bad news. And even if it's, even if you're going from like one of those single digit acceptance rate schools to like 1 in 4, it's really noticeable to you. If I can give good news out 1 out of 4 times versus like 7 out of 100 times, kind of thing. But there's just mixed everything, because sometimes those super selective schools, not always, but sometimes they have more money and sometimes they pay better. So like everything, there's like pros and cons. So anyway, that was a long one. I feel like I jammed like 3 in 1 there.
Yeah, it's a combo package.
So let's get to our question for the day.
Sure. This question comes from Ellen from Massachusetts, and I think she asks a really great question. And she says, I can't remember if you addressed this on a podcast yet. You probably did, but it might need repeating. What are your thoughts if a student's test scores were in the old 50% range pre-COVID, but now they are below the 25% mark? I know the scores are spiraling up, and it is self-fulfilling with students holding back lower test scores. It is just hard to tell a kid with a 32 ACT, for example, that it isn't worth submitting when the range is 33 to 35. I think this is a question that many families are struggling with, and I'd love to hear your thoughts here or on the podcast in the future.
Yeah, and I feel like we have talked about this question, but I feel like it's such an important question that we can't assume everybody's heard every episode, and we can't even assume if you've heard every episode that, you have a perfect memory. or that your mind didn't wander at that point that we talked about that. So I wanted to take this question, even that I feel we have addressed it. So, and I do know that this is something that everybody is a lot of people are wrestling with. I'm wrestling with it as a counselor. It's really hard. I have a student. I just had a conversation with this student. She has a 34 super scored ACT, and she's trying to ask, do I submit that or not to one of the most selective schools in the country? Like, do you know how hard of the conversation that is? Like, do I submit my top 1% score? That's really difficult. So this is one of the pros and cons of test optional. One of the pros is you now get to decide how schools are going to evaluate you when it comes to your scores, where before you never had that option. And so that can be really, really nice, especially for people that have all the other things, but the test score is the weaker part of their application. But the downside is this, that people are smart. And if you're giving me the choice of submitting or not submitting my scores, guess who submits their scores? The stronger testers. What does that do? It elevates the averages. So the real question here is, when you're trying to discern whether to submit or not submit, do you need to look at the re-norm scores, the new higher scores? And before I answer it, I want to stop and answer this question. Why is it that scores are important to colleges? Because when we understand why scores are important to colleges, then you'll partly understand the answer to that question. So if I said to you that question, why are scores important to colleges, what would you say, Lisa? How would you answer that?
Well, I think there's what would be the obvious thing is it helps them decide who is more academically prepared to handle their programs than not. But also we know that those numbers. The test scores go into ratings like U.S. News and World Report. That's part of their ranking, and other things. And so it's not just to determine academic fitness. It's also it's a marketing tool. People think that if the college is more selective, like if they have higher test scores, it's better. Even though that's not true, probably.
Yeah, so I think you really nailed it. So from the first, there's two answers to this question. The first one is there's some research that shows that test scores correlate to, different studies. You'll see 0.57, it depends on different studies you read, but there's a correlation between test scores and first year grades. And so there's some that are using it as a predictor of can the student handle the academic work? And there's some correlation. I mean, grades are better predictor, but grades and scores actually are better predictor than just grades. The problem is scores come with so much other baggage, right? Like, can people put them in perspective, or will they put too much weight on them? Because I've said this before, numbers do voodoo on your brain, and most people can't put scores in perspective. And then you have the whole mental health. What are we doing to our kids? And people don't like fueling the multi-billion-dollar test prep industry. So the people ask, do the pros outweigh the cons? But nobody has ever said, who's being honest, that there's no predictive value at all to scores. The question is, does the minuscule value you get by adding it to grades warrant all the other baggage that comes with it? And that's where most people are coming to the conclusion that it doesn't. But for some, that is, we can't deny, and especially for schools that don't have the resources to really do, some deeper research, it's just a shorthand, quick way of doing things. And in this age of grade inflation, if you're not doing much research, a kid with straight A's and an 840 SAT is a different kid than a kid with straight A's and a 1560. So for some, there's that piece of it. Okay. And I don't want to pretend that that's not a component of it. But you really hit the second piece, which is really important, and it's the marketing angle. And I would contend it's not so much rankings, although different ranking organizations apportion a different percentage of test scores into their formula. Some don't do it at all, some do it a lot, some do it a little. I would argue that just scores in and of themselves are used by the public, the same way that acceptance rates are independent of rankings. They're just one of those things people use. Test scores are used independent of rank. I'll never forget this family. I worked with them twice. I'll never forget the dad saying the first thing I look at is the test scores when I look at a school. And to him, higher scores meant better school. And so people being mindful of that, admissions is not mindful of that. One thing about admissions is because you are consumer facing all the time, you get a very good read on how the public thinks about things. You're constantly getting feedback from people who are not in the school yet, what they think of different things. So they're not naive about the fact that the public will evaluate them and they'll compare them and say, oh, your scores are better than or higher than your school, this school. For a lot of people, they will interpret that as better school or more prestige. Better school or more prestige. That's just how a lot of the public thinks. So the other thing that the public does is they compare your scores to the previous year. And the public is not just the parent and the applicant. It can be alumni. It could be your own faculty. It can be the provost, president, or the board. It can be a lot of different stakeholders. And what is the trend line? And so if the trend line is not in the right direction, they're not going to like that either. And if they don't like how you compare to your peers, why did our number one competitor see their scores jump 60 points, or 2 points on an ACT, and we went down or we stayed the same? Like, those are the kinds of questions you could expect to get answered. So this is that second point you brought up, which is the marketing angle. And because of that marketing angle, if everything shifts now so that only the people that submit scores are the people with higher scores, if that's the new bar, and then that's the new bar the public's being evaluated by, we don't want to be the only ones that are using an old metric when everybody else is using a new metric. So I said all that to say that as painful as it may sound, you really need to use new numbers. You need to use the renorm numbers. I was just going over this with a student yesterday, and we pulled up, and I looked at Boston University's 2021 SAT numbers. Now, if you look at the math scores, they look really, really high. 700, 780 is the range. But then guess what? 32% of people submitted SAT and 13 submitted an ACT. So part of this is becoming a game almost. Like, okay, the numbers are really high with very small percentage of test submitters.
Right.
But what that should encourage you about is that means that if you don't submit, you're going into a really large pool of non-submitters. So I know it may feel bad that you work to get a 32, which I haven't looked it up, but it's probably 97th percentile nationally. And you can't submit something that's 97th percentile nationally. That feels like a crime. But if you're going to pull down the averages of the school, you're putting yourself in a competitive disadvantage. And why do that? But here's the good news. The majority of people are not submitting these days.
Mm-hmm.
The majority of people. So you are not some huge outlier. So anyway, I've been talking for a long time. I just want to stop in here and see what you're percolating in your head.
I was listening to last week's episode when Julia was talking about a student of hers that submitted a really good test score, but it was maybe like on the lower end of the range, the new range for the schools that she was applying, and she didn't do that well.
It was a 1490.
Yeah, I mean, the feedback that Julia got is like, well, she submitted an average piece of data about herself. And we are looking for people with only above average pieces of data, all above averages. So that hurt her because she submitted an average piece of data, which I was kind of stunned by, but I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I still think schools will give you the advice if you're at the midpoint or above, submit. Mm-hmm. That's still good advice. But what I would say is be at the midpoint of the new numbers, not the old numbers. You definitely don't want to be in any bottom 25th percentile. Definitely don't want to do that. Because one of the things the schools often do is they often do report their scores as a middle 50th percentile, the 25th to the 75th. So you don't want to be at that. Now, I have shared this on the podcast before, at least twice, but I'm going to say it again because of what I said before. Who knows who listens to everything? Or if they're daydreaming on me, or whatever. So I had a conversation with a high-level person at Yale about this exact thing. I said, what score should I tell people to submit if it is in a difficult demographic for you to attract? I understand what you're going to say if it is a student that is considered more mainstream, that is coming from college-educated parents, that is not first-gen, and that is either an international, Caucasian, or Asian applicants that would not be considered underrepresented. I know what you're going to say. Let them at least be at the midpoint. But what if I'm working with a more difficult demographic? I know that, you'd be happy to get certain kids that are super hard for you to get, that you have all the evidence in the world. They can do your academic program. They're going to make huge contributions, and they're going to bring a perspective that's lacking on your campus, and they're valuable to you. I get that. What advice am I supposed to give to them? Do you remember me saying this before? Lisa, I'm going to see how many times I've said it. Do you remember what the Yale rep said? Because I know you hear every episode.
I do not.
Oh, now I'm glad you said that because I was worried I'm telling the story too many times. So I was hoping you would say you don't. All right. So what she said was, I have the Appalachian region. I would say that word wrong. Did I get that word right or not?
That's right.
Time? Okay,
yeah.
I got it right. All right.
You're good.
Yeah. She said, I would do a cartwheel to get a kid with a 31 ACT. That might be the highest score they've had in 5 years. If you look at Yale's numbers, 33 to 35 are their middle 50%. So here's a kid in the bottom quarter, and she would like that to submit. So this is why it's tricky that you can't just give the advice, look at the middle 50th percent. Context matters. Schools look at, there's a concept Rod Skinner talked about, distance traveled. If you're coming from a school where the average test scores are just in the toilet, your 31 can look good. And if you're extremely hard to get demographic, Native American is one. If you read going back 20 years, but if you read the Gatekeepers, which is kind of really similar to like Geoffrey Salingo's book, where he sat in Davidson and WashU and Emory's admission process. But there it was sitting in Wesleyan's university process, and it tracks 5 students. Jock Steinberg wrote it. It's the original book that did that. He talks about a Native American student with, don't quote me, but his SAT was like just over 1,000, which was completely outside of Wesleyan's pool. But it was such a hot catch because they just hardly ever get somebody like that. So that's what makes this advice even more tricky, is that if you're coming from an underrepresented population, and then we probably get in a whole conversation, well, who qualifies as that, then this middle 50% number may not apply to you, which I know makes it even more tricky. And so then the question is, well, what do you do about that? Well, there are some admission counselors that welcome that really complex, nuanced conversation, that you can actually have that with them. And if you're working with somebody to guide you, then of course you could have that with them. But that is an important caveat that you mention, because it's not a one size fits all, this middle 50% rule.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I know it feels bad. I mean, I'm thinking of a kid I worked with last year that's going to Brown and did not submit a 33 ACT, did not submit it, went test optional, got in, was under the middle 50%.
Yeah. At some point, it makes testing meaningless, though. Why bother? Unless you think you can get like a 36 or a 1600, if you're going for those highly selective schools, what's the point? It's seems like don't waste your time on it. Go spend that time you would spend prepping, doing something amazing, which, it's fine by me. But
yeah, and I'm actually really glad you brought this point up. And once again, we're talking about a small number of schools that, we're talking about the 1%ers. Friends, keep in mind, Julia works at a place where it's not uncommon for more than half of the senior class to apply to Harvard. So I'm going to quote Cliff Thornton, retired admission officer extraordinaire, 30 plus years on Wesleyan's admission staff. He came and spoke as a keynote speaker to a big event that Susan and I organized in Westchester, Pennsylvania, back in 2005. And he was asked by a parent from Germantown Friends, which is a leading school in the Philadelphia area, my student could get straight A's if they went to another school. Are you going to take that into consideration? And Cliff Thornton said, to whom much is given, much is required. So when you are coming from a school like where Julia's at, that's labeled privileged, and you're up against that kind of stiff competition, an average score can be seen different than it is in some school contexts, and of sort of like an average school. So that's also something to keep in mind. We have all kinds of different hosts who work with all kinds of different students, different backgrounds, part of the diversity we're trying to give you so you can get all kinds of different perspectives. But this whole shifting has moved everywhere. It's not just when I'm talking about when we talk with those lofty numbers like at least a 34 ACT or at least, into the 1500s. And sometimes, and even if you're in the 1500s on the SAT, that may not be good if you're applying to a math-oriented subject and you're not, if you had a 1500 SAT and it was 800 verbal and 700 math, be honest, there's a sizable numbers of schools that wouldn't actually like that score if you were applying for a major like computer science or engineering or business. There's probably, I'm just guessing, but there's probably 30 to maybe even 40 schools in the country that would not be a good score for. Mm-hmm. So it even gets more complex than that when we're looking at this process. But yeah, I think there's some wisdom to what you're saying, because what this actually practically means is, like, if you early on know that you are aspiring to those kinds of schools, and you're not getting those kinds of scores, I'm thinking of a student right now that I'm actually working with. She's got really, really good grades and good rigor, and she's just not testing that great for those kinds of schools, like her ACT's in the high 20s. But for those kinds of schools that she's aspiring to, so I'm having that conversation now. Like, I think you just may want to forget, because they're like, they're about to plunk down some money on test prep and pour into it and do all this, that, the other. I don't see it being worth it unless you adjust your list. But keep in mind, the scores are just one piece. This is very important. A lot of times people think, oh, I'm emancipated. I'm free. Ooh, my ticket to heaven, no scores. And like, let's see your rigor. And did you do well in that rigor? If it's a student looking, let's say, at math stuff, engineering, how did you do in AP Physics and BC Calc? Right? And so, once again, I hesitate sometimes having these conversations, Lisa, because we're kind of talking about the 1% to 2% of the most selective institutions. And I don't want to give the impression that you need to go there or something's wrong if you don't go there. People do perfectly fine to go to, other institutions. I was having this conversation with somebody recently, and we were having a conversation with a student with the 21 on the ACT that wants to do engineering. And the person was telling me, just to be blunt, they're like, they're screwed. 21 ACT engineering, this is not going to happen. And I had to say, wait a minute. First of all, they just finished their sophomore year. Secondly, there's lots of schools out there. Mm-hmm. There's lots of regional publics that you'd be fine. And this student also has high grades. Grades are a better predictor than scores. This person could just be test optional, applied for engineering, and they'll be fine. They're not going to go to one of the who's who haloed engineering schools, most likely, but they'll be perfectly fine. So I can't emphasize this enough that when we get into talking about these really high school scores and these really schools with low acceptance rate, it's just a fraction of the college-going population, and it really doesn't apply to the masses.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, like I've worked with kids, let's say who have like anxiety or a learning difference. And so, they just can't on the testing. And so they're not trying to get into, Harvard, but it's very helpful for them to not have to submit a score that would like disqualify them from a lot of places. It's a gift, I tell you, because, these kids, if you get to know them, they're amazing and they're going to do really great wherever they go. So, I mean, I feel like that's really helpful also.
I'm glad you brought that point up because I feel bad. I have several kids I can think of I'm working with right now who will go in and take a practice test under no pressure, and they will score so much higher than how they do on the real test because of the test anxiety issue. Like the kid is clearly capable, but that test anxiety just gets them on the real deal.
Yeah. I mean, I see that
at least
with
3 kids that I can think of.
I see that with my own kids, like Thomas. He's like stone cold on a test, and he always scores really high. Sonia, arguably the better student and the more thoughtful person. Sorry, Thomas. Gets nervous on tests, and then she doesn't show as well on those. But that is not a really true estimate of who she is as a student or a scholar or a person.
Yeah. Sorry, Thomas and Sonia. Part of having parents that are hosts is we use you as examples, but this is why we're glad that you don't listen to our podcast.
Yeah, thank God my kids find me. If I hear my voice on the podcast in the car, like if I'm picking them up, then they're like, turn that off. So I'm guaranteed I can say whatever I want about them, and they will never know.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's wrap this up. I think hopefully it was helpful, Ella.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, very excited about this interview. If you would have told me, name 5 people you want to interview, Jon Boeckenstedt would have been one of them. We featured him before in his articles, certainly quoted him widely. And this is a different kind of interview. It's actually over the next 3 weeks because we really jump around and hit a lot of different topics. We'll talk a lot in further episodes of his higher ed data stories. So we're going to go deep into that. But in this one, what we really do is we just kind of jump around. We talk a lot about ethics in college admissions, and we take a look at certain practices and say, is this ethical or is it not ethical? And I know after Jon does his introduction and gives his backstory, we just talk about kind of ethics and admissions, and never one shy to give his opinion. You get the insights of somebody with close to 40 years of experience who's one of the real leaders in the field. Without any further ado, I introduce you to Jon Boeckenstedt. Friends, you're in for a real treat today. I'm here with Jon Boeckenstedt from Oregon State University. He's the Vice Provost of Enrollment. Welcome to the Your College Bound Kid podcast, Jon.
Thanks. It's great to be here, Mark.
Well, I would say if there were 5 people in the admissions world that I would want to interview, you would definitely be on the list. And you're actually not a new name to our listeners, although I probably mispronounced your name. But we've featured several of your articles before and often quote you. So it's a real treat, not only for me, but for our listeners as well. So, Jon, why don't you give your backstory? Let our listeners know your history, particularly anything related to higher ed, so they have a sense of the context to which you'll speak through.
Sure. I kind of fell into higher education and admissions by accident. I was, we talk a lot today about first-generation college students. I was actually a first-generation high school student. Neither of my parents went past the 8th grade in their formal education. And so when I got out of college, I was working door-to-door as a cable TV salesperson, and I saw an ad for an admissions counselor at Mount Mercy College. And the thing that struck me right away about the job was that I hadn't had a very sophisticated college search when I was a senior in high school. And I ended up going someplace for a year, dropping out for a year and a half, and transferring someplace else. And I said, it would be really great to be able to help kids make better and more informed decisions about college admissions. So I applied for this job kind of on a whim. I ended up getting the job, and kind of the rest is history. I spent 3 years in that job at Mount Mercy. I went to the University of Dallas for 3 years. I went to Grinnell College in the middle of Iowa, back in my home state, for 3 years. I did a little 2-year consulting stint with a company that worked with not-for-profits. And then I spent 7 years at St. Bonaventure University in upstate New York. Most of my time in the field has been spent at DePaul University in Chicago, where I stayed for 17 years, watched my kids grow up during that time. And when my youngest graduated from college and I was kind of full of the 3 hours of a daily commute in Chicago, I said, maybe I'll think of something different. The job at Oregon State came up. It was perfect. We loved Oregon, loved the land grant mission, and the rest is history. And I've been here for 3 years now.
That's really helpful, and it's one of the reasons why we asked for the backstory. I'm very familiar with your writings, and I've picked up a very strong passion for access, equity, diversity, equity, inclusion, anything to do with equity, justice. Do you think some of that comes from being, what's the term for first gen, for not even high school? Have you coined a term for that yet?
I haven't yet. It's interesting. All of my ancestors come from Germany, and they came over in the 1840s. And so I started doing a little bit of research. They moved to this very liberal little democratic enclave in Iowa called New Vienna. And I did some research, and I found out that most of them were coming because they were draft dodgers. They didn't want their children to be conscripted into the military at the time. And there were also some economic challenges and problems in that part of what's now Germany. It wasn't even Germany then. And so, I think my attitudes and my opinions have always been shaped by that ancestry and that sense of right and wrong and fairness and opportunity. And I remember a college professor looking around the class and said, if some of you had been born a Kennedy, some of you would be running for president right now. And he looked right at me when he said it. And I don't know if he did that on purpose or not.
Hey, it stuck with you.
That, the block you're born on has more to do with where you end up in life than almost anything else. And if we can break out of that cycle and really make opportunity available for students for whom it's otherwise not available, I think all of the world and all of society gets better. So yeah, that drives me a lot.
That's great. I'd love to jump into a series of topics with you. One of them I'd love to talk to is, you're the first person I've seen come up with this concept, and I think it's so accurate, and it's the concept of draw rate. Why don't you explain to our listeners what draw rate is and why it's a better gauge of market power than what's so often used, which is, selectivity acceptance rate. As I think that's an important concept.
Yeah. So, in the early '80s, when U.S. News and World Report started coming about, right, one of the things that they would look at would be selectivity. And so colleges learned pretty quickly that if you wanted to move up in the rankings, or if you wanted people to think more highly of you, you should get more selective. And the problem with that is you can pretty easily manipulate the admission rate, the selectivity rate, based on a lot of different ways to do things. The problem is if you manipulate it, your yield rate goes down. And for the listeners, I know you have a sophisticated audience, but for the listeners who don't know what a yield rate is, if you admit 1,000 students and 300 enroll, that's a yield rate of 30%. 30% of your admission offers enrolled. And so if you artificially decrease your selectivity, it hits you on the back end with yield rate. And draw rate is yield rate divided by selectivity. And so it keeps you from sort of fudging the numbers and cheating and trying to artificially lower one rate because it accounts for it on the back end. And so I think it's also a much better way to separate out the big dogs from the little dogs in college admissions. So, you can say that two colleges both have an admit rate of about 10%, for instance, or 5% or whatever it happens to be. But when you look at draw rates, the nationwide average is about 0.4 or 0.5, 0.4 or 0.5. Stanford's is 18. Right. And so you get a much nicer and a much bigger spread of institutions when you look at draw rate. And you get a real sense of not only are these places selective, but almost everybody who gets admitted ends up enrolling, which is a real testament to the draw and the power of those institutions. And when you look at the draw rates of the Ivies, they follow a pretty standard pecking order. You see who's at the top and you see who's at the bottom, and it makes absolute sense with the rest of the market. So I like using it. I didn't invent it. I don't really remember the first time I heard it, but it was sometime back in the 1980s or maybe early 1990s. And it was kind of mentioned as an offhanded thing. I wish more than I could imagine that I could credit the person who told it to me first. And I racked my brain and I can't figure it out.
That's okay. And just to give an example of how Jon got at that 18. So Stanford has a 72% yield, and we know they were at 80 pretty recently, but the numbers have dropped recently, right? And a 4% admit rate, you divide 4 into 72, and that's how you get that 18. Yeah. What I like about it is it kind of exposes the people that are let's say being a little manipulative, maybe too strong of a word, but using a lot of market gimmickry to drive down their admit rate, right?
We won't name names, bro.
Yeah, but you and I don't have names in mind.
We do.
I've described you as someone who's not afraid to break glass, a contrarian. So I'm surprised you're not coming out the chute naming names today, but.
Well, I don't know. I think there's a time. Nothing makes me more angry when I see a college talking about itself than stuff that I know is kind of fabricated and artificial. And that's when I will name names.
Sure.
We all work in kind of an environment that demands we serve two masters, right? I mean, if you're in admissions and you're not student focused or student centered, you're really in the wrong job, right? You could go sell insurance or cars or do something and probably make a lot more money doing that. But at the same time, colleges need revenue to operate, right?
Sure.
Faculty don't work for free. The grass doesn't cut itself. The buildings don't run on sunshine. You need electricity and natural gas and things. And we have bills to pay. And so we are a business, and we have to pay attention to those sort of things that, many of us would probably prefer not to have to worry about. But that's just the way the world works, unfortunately. And so it's that's kind of the challenge, but it's also what's interesting to me about this business and about this life that I've chosen is that I get to have a foot in both worlds, right? And I get to manage that. There was an old Hall & Oates album called Along the Red Ledge, and this was a poetic reference, and I can't remember the name of the poet, who said, it's moving ahead while balancing. between the one precipice, one falling off this side of the cliff and the other. And that's really, I think, what we talk about and what we're saying when we talk about college admissions work.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, for our recommended resource for episode 259, I'm going to introduce you not just to a book, but to an author you really need to be familiar with. And if you're new to our podcast, you may not be. And that author is Paul Tough. Paul Tough is one of these writers. He's a Canadian American writer and broadcaster. But everything he writes, you just need to read. He puts that level of research into what he does. In fact, his first book, which we've had on as a recommended resource before, I urge you to read this book if you haven't. It's called How Children Succeed, Grit, Curiosity, and the Hidden Power of Character. Once again, that's already been a recommended resource. I'm just reminding you in case you haven't read that book. And then he wrote another book. It was originally called The Years That Matter Most, How College Makes or Breaks Us. But then he actually changed the title when he came out in another version. It's called The Inequality Machine, How College Divides Us. We also recommended that book before. Today's recommended resource is a third book that we haven't recommended, but it's worth reading. It's an older book. It came out in 2008. It's called Whatever It Takes. And what Paul Tough does in this book is he looks at the Harlem Children's Zone, and he studies how did they do this? How did they take this one area and completely transform it? And so it's a combination of education, business, social work, sociology, leaders coming together to completely transform a community. It's absolutely worth reading. It's called Whatever It Takes by Paul Tough. But as you can tell, I'm really recommending that you read the trilogy of books he has written and be on the lookout for anything else he writes. And I'll also say this, his books are very well footnoted, so you can get great references to additional sources. Once again, a recommended resource, Paul Tough. Will now return to my interview with Jon Boeckenstedt. No, and we've often talked on the podcast about the tension between being in this for students and being student-centric, but then how institutional priorities, particularly things related to revenue, oftentimes create that tension. But I really like the way you put it. We're called to serve two masters. I actually never heard it quite put that way. And I think it really just gets down to the gist of it, and it gets down to the tension. And that leads me to a series of some questions I'd love to ask you regarding admissions practices where certain schools do certain things, let's say to drive down their admit rate or to appear more selective. And I'm wondering which of the things I'll list you consider to be just completely astute business practices, prudent on the part of the institution, it's a little shrewd, it's effective, versus it sort of crosses a line of impropriety.
Sure.
So I think one that we probably all would agree is crossing a line of impropriety, and it's an easy way to drive your admit rate down, is to target people you have no intention of admitting. And by the way, you're not too far away from this. A recent guest on our podcast was Sue Corner, Dean of Admissions at Willamette, and she spoke to the topic of how easy it is to manipulate your admit rate and your rankings. So we're getting a nice little Pacific Northwest flair here on that topic. But I think you would agree with that, right? You can use student search, you can buy names, you can be a school that accepts, as she put it, you can be a school that accepts B+ students, but you can make a C student feel like they're going to get admitted with some very misleading marketing. So would that be clearly in the line of line crossing?
Well, what if I gave it a score from 0 to 100?
Oh, that's even better.
That's a 98% not good, I would say.
There you go.
And the reason is,
yeah.
The reason there's that little 2% that creeps in is that, we say all the time that there are characteristics and qualities and measurements that go beyond academic measures and test scores and grade point average and those sort of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we all know that there are extraordinarily talented, creative, wonderful fully functioning, well-developed minds out there that don't do well in a traditional school system, but would really thrive at a college or university. And if a college genuinely says, no one says this, to be honest, but if a college genuinely says, we can find those students and give them a chance, then you have to cast a wide net, right? But that's not the way it works in practice. The way it works in practice is places that are already extraordinarily selective want to generate a lot of applications from students they don't need to give a second look to. It's grist I call it grist for the rejection mill, right? And those students are unfortunate victims of what I call the admissions industrial complex, that sort of that warlike machinery that gears up to try to affect the outcomes that the college wants. And I think, so I would say it's 98% bad.
No, and I love your idea of using a 100-point scale there, because you can also have some nuance. So the 2% would be to account for the late bloomer. Is that primarily the person that maybe, they will learn about this and an opportunity will be created? Maybe they'll have a clear upward trajectory. But then again, the motive, I guess, is oftentimes maybe the factor there, if you're really looking at it from an intent standpoint, right?
That's right. I remember an interview I had with a student at the University of Dallas, back in the late 80s. And he was from Chicago and he had pretty abysmal grades. But I had never met a more interesting, charming, erudite, articulate young man in my life. He talked about philosophy and history and was well-read. He just didn't like school, right? Or at least not high school.
Too
and
cool
so he
for
was
school.
looking for a place, an intellectual community where he could fit in. And to the extent that we always want to be able to give students like that an opportunity or, a chance just to succeed and become the best version of themselves, then yes, it's the late bloomer, it's the diamond in the rough, it's the misfit, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think we all kind of have a soft spot in our hearts for misfits, students who just don't fit into the environment they find themselves in. And I think that's why we would do it. But again, I think the cost to the thousands of students who get their hopes dashed on the rocks is probably not worth it in the big scheme of things.
All right, let's look at several others, because as you know, there's a lot of them out here, right? What about the idea of simply not admitting a kid? You could comment on either denying or waitlisting. I'll throw two things out. One is because you're tracking engagement scoring and predictive modeling, and you believe they have a low probability of coming. So you're trying to lower your admit rate to improve your brand, and you don't want to waste an admit on a kid based on predictive modeling. And then I'll add a second one, nothing to do with predictive modeling, just pure metrics. So, I'll just throw a scenario. Let's say your average kid has a 3.0, 1,000 on an SAT, and now all of a sudden you get this kid and they're a 1550 and a 397. And you're like, look, this kid's going to get in all our competitors and we don't yield well against our competitors. So we'll waitlist or deny and make them prove they want to come to us. Do you think those are completely acceptable practices and shrewd and smart marketing, or do you think how would you scale those out?
Oh, I would say, for the first one, I think it depends a lot on who you're talking about.
Okay.
So just like SAT scores are a measurement that probably work well within a high school where all students have similar backgrounds and similar academic opportunities, I think then the SAT can be a reasonably good sorter of ability. If you're looking at demonstrated interest among students at a private prep school in Dallas, Texas, right, then demonstrated interest might really be a good thing because students are sort of signaling that they're a better fit with you or not. The problem is when you're comparing the demonstrative interest of a student at a prep school in Dallas versus a kid from a public school in Kentucky, where, more students are on reduced or free lunches, that's problematic to me because the student with the advantages knows the game. He or she interacts with people who can coach about how to make interest look stronger versus the student who's entering it completely open and naive about how the system works. So demonstrated interest within pockets of similar students, I think, is probably okay. Just like if you were hiring someone for a job, that person that emails you and follows up and asks good questions is probably a better candidate, right?
Yeah.
But not systematically and not in the big picture, because then we're denying opportunity to students who probably should have it. And I forgot your second question.
Yeah. I loved how you added the nuance there. I thought that was great. The second question is, it was the kid who is a real high flyer in your applicant pool. It has nothing to do with demonstrated interest. It's just off metrics. Statistically, we don't yield many kids like this. So we don't want to waste an acceptance on this kid,
right?
Because that's going to lower our acceptance or make our acceptance rate look higher. So we'll sort of make them prove to us that they are really interested. Some deny, actually, and then you can't prove, but some waitlist.
Yeah.
And so the question is that shrewd, strategic, that's an appropriate way to serve the other master and it's fair game, or does that cross a line of impropriety?
I think I would say that's 70% bad, probably.
Okay.
in the sense that the cruel, harsh reality is that the more colleges do things like that, the more popular they become in subsequent years.
I know.
Right? So colleges are horribly disincentivized from doing the right thing in that case and admitting that student who would be a good fit and probably a high achieving academic student. I think denies don't happen very often with students like that anymore. I think mostly it's waitlist activity. And so
because what if you're wrong? What if you're wrong and the kid really wants to come? You've blown it out of the water.
Well, if you look at any class, I mean, it's Harvard, it's Oregon State, it's Grinnell, it's, DePaul. You have really high flyers in every class, right? We have students here at Oregon State that were admitted to Ivy League institutions. And if we said, they're going to Princeton, no way are we going to admit them, we would lose that opportunity. But we're not obsessed. We try to be more about access than we are about those artificial trappings of success in higher education. So we would never, ever do something like that in the first place. But I think if a college is trying to climb the ranks and wants to be better known and well known, that's unfortunately one of the things that they might do in order to move that student to the wait list and make him or her come back and say, I really am interested. I don't like it, but I understand why it happens.
Sure. Friends, this completes the first half. We hope you'll join us next week for the final part.
Preview for 260 for Monday's episode. After our announcement time, we will start a brand new interview on Monday with Darrell Edmonds, the Deputy Director of the University of Delaware. We will be discussing changes occurring at the University of Delaware. It is a two-parter that will run over the next 2 Mondays.
And friends, remember, it's not where you go, but it's what you do when you get there, and it's what you do when you get out of there. And that's really what Dave and I were talking about today in terms of using opportunities like experiential learning. That is what will determine your career success. See you next week, everybody.
See you next week.
And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 14. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel, and to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh.
manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stylianos Dimitriou. If you want to have a coaching session with Lisa or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcast. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Thursday.